I'm Tracy Dorfman, the Director of Development at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. It is my great pleasure today to welcome you to our virtual presentation, Sipping from the Nile with Jean Naggar. This program continues our series about global Jewish life. Please consider joining us on Sunday, September 12th at 1 p.m. for the last 100 years of Ashkenazim in Mexico, Shifting Identity Definitions. This presentation with Adina Semet will discuss the formation of this community, their extraordinary efforts to create a framework of meaning through their ideological Jewish perspectives, and the changing ways they have defined themselves throughout history into today. At the close of the program, we will share a link to register for that event. The presentation today will largely be focusing on the story of just one family, that of our presenter. As you will hear, she and her family had a very unique experience, which we are especially excited to hear about. Please be aware that you can continue to explore this story through our speaker's book, Sipping from the Nile, My Exodus from Egypt, which you can purchase through the link in our chat. Now, please allow me to introduce Jean Naggar. Jean Naggar is the founder of Jean V. Naggar Literary Agency, JVNLA, which she has presided over for 40 years. She is also the author of a memoir, Sipping from the Nile, My Exodus from Egypt, and a novel, Footprints on the Heart. Her poetry has been featured in The Listener and The Athenor, and she has been published in the New York Times, The Village Voice, Publishers Weekly, and Reader's Digest. Mother of 3 and grandmother of 7, Jean is the past president of the Association of Authors Representatives and a member of the Authors Guild, International Women's Forum, and the Women's Media Group. She was honored as Woman of the Year by the WMG in 2018. Jean, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and particular thanks also to Laura Grant, who had a lot of patience with me over the technical stuff I got mixed up with, and to Trillian Atwood. I'm very happy to be talking to everyone today, and I thought I'd start with a brief snapshot of the political background then, because that was what led to my family and so many others who'd made Egypt their home for over 200 years, overnight to becoming persona non grata, simply because they were Jewish, regardless of nationality or the huge contributions they and their forebears had made to the cultural richness and economic stability of the country. Expelled in an instant, they left behind possessions large and small, and generations of history. Many were incarcerated, and those with Egyptian passports lost their Egyptian nationality, cast into a world that mostly did not know what to make of them, catapulted into recreating themselves and their lives. It was hardest for my parents' generation. I was young and eager to move into a wider world. I'm talking about the fall of 1956, in what is now an almost forgotten footnote in history. President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, in the fall of 1956, nationalized the Suez Canal. In that moment, centuries of Jewish heritage and a long history of peaceful interaction with Arab neighbors was dealt a death blow. In response to the attack on the Suez Canal, British and French troops assembled to advance toward Cairo, joined by Israeli forces coming across the desert. They had intended to protect free passage of goods and equipment through the canal. In America, political maneuverings of Secretary Dulles, together with the UN and with Russia joining the protest, compelled the British and the French and the Israelis to retreat before reaching Cairo, which left, for those of us living in Cairo, a dangerous vacuum. That was the time when a way of life died forever. Deeply rooted Jewish communities, as well as the British and French expatriates who had made Egypt their home in a post-colonial world, found themselves exposed to the unknown, unwelcome in their lives, vulnerable to whatever retaliations the Egyptian government might devise. Over all of us Jews loomed the ominous shadow of Nazi Germany. We knew we were trapped without protections in a country outraged by the Israeli participation in the aborted invasion. Along with immediate expulsion, or conversely, the lack of any way to leave the country for many months, came the huge stress of fear, the loss of personal dignity, personal possessions, small and large fortunes. But in the end, the greatest loss was the total disruption of family life as we knew it. Extended families far flung across continents and oceans, a way of life swept into oblivion in a moment. For most of us who lost so much as we dispersed into exile all over the world, the greatest loss was not material possessions, although that was often great, but the undefinable loss, the sudden disappearance of a way of life, and of close-knit families and communities scattered abruptly and permanently all over the world. For me personally, 1956 had seemed a year ahead filled with promise. I was 18. I left my life as a schoolgirl after 5 years of boarding school in England and returned to Egypt early that fall, just before the world convulsed and changed the course of my life. I was 18, life should have been beginning, but it felt like an end. I had ordered books to be sent from England for my university courses. I was excited about that. They never arrived. We had barely been home a week in that early return after summer vacation, when the shockwaves from that moment in history propelled thousands out of their familiar paths and flung them, unprepared, into a larger life and wider world. As Jews, we understood that we were now strangers in our homeland, unwelcome in our lives, vulnerable to whatever retaliations the Egyptian government might devise. Happily, the violence was never to escalate to the level of the terrible tragedies of World War II, but it was not so far away from World War II, and who knew that then? Awareness of the fate of Jews in Europe and the inability to see what would follow for us brought its own terrors. I was born in Alexandria, Egypt in December 1937, in the home of my maternal grandparents, Joseph and Rosa Smuha. I was the eldest child of their sixth child of a family of 9. I was one of 26 grandchildren, and I grew up on the borders of the Nile in Giza, Cairo, with my parents and siblings in the home of my paternal grandmother, Jean Naggar, a widow, and my unmarried Aunt Helen. Auntie Helen managed the household and was a colonel in the Red Cross. That says it all. So Passover preparations every year called for her organizational talents. And I'm going to turn to the book to read you a small passage. Talking about Passover and Auntie Helen. Ritual required the presence of a shoulder of lamb, complete with knucklebone, on the Seder table. Auntie Helen, who was responsible for ordering the food, had great difficulty every year securing the 2 shoulders she needed from the butcher for the 2 Seder nights. It was a perilous process and she could not risk failure. So one year, convinced that she had solved the problem, she ordered an entire lamb from the kosher butcher. "Look what that Ibn el-Kelb, that son of a dog, did to me," she wailed when it arrived. reduced to the ultimate Arabic insult in her despair, her face a mask of tragedy, while my father tried to stifle his laughter. He has ruined our holiday. The butcher had sent the lamb minus the 2 shoulders, and only the full force of her most strident fury produced the meat she needed in time for the holiday. So the next year, she decided to go one step further and circumvent the problem. Some weeks before the holiday, a sheep took up residence in the garden. Intrigued, my brother Jeff and I fed it berseem, bunches of parsley, that it seemed to enjoy, and we spent time playing with it every day. My mother grew increasingly apprehensive as the day of doom approached. Afraid of the irreparable damage that the truth might inflict on the delicate psyches of her offspring, she carefully instructed all the house staff, my father, my grandmother, and my aunt, that no one should make the connection for us between the pet that had mysteriously disappeared and the tender brown roasted shoulders of lamb that would soon be set out on the Seder tables. The night after the sheep's disappearance from the garden, Vera, in despair, summoned my mother to our bedroom long after bedtime. I don't know what has happened to the children, she declared. I can't get them to listen. You need to come at once and help me to calm them down. My mother followed her back to the room and found Jeff and me jumping happily on our beds on either side of the room, shouting something to each other that convulsed us with giggles. With mounting distress, she listened to what we were shouting. Fein il kharoof, where is the sheep, one of us would say, and the other would respond in sepulchral tones, fil talaga, in the icebox, a response that set off hysterical laughter again. So much for our delicate sensibilities. The one person she had forgotten to caution was Aboudi the gardener, who had grinned wickedly as he responded to our surprise at finding the sheep gone from the garden. I was an only child until I was 5, but I was surrounded by a large, diverse Sephardic Jewish family with deep cultural roots in Italy, the Middle East, and England. My origins peel back on my mother's side to Baghdad, Damascus, and Manchester, England, and to Italy, Spain, and Holland on my father's side. Egypt then was as diverse, sophisticated, and culturally open as New York City is today. There were Italian, Greek, Armenian, Turkish, Syrian, and Lebanese communities dating back several generations, and flourishing respected Jewish communities, numbering some 80,000, some of which could be traced back to the time of Maimonides. Writings, letters, household lists, and other means of everyday communication were discovered some years ago above a synagogue in Old Cairo. Known as the Geniza Collection, it is now largely housed at Cambridge University in England and is bringing fabric and dimension to the long history of Jews in Egypt, as well as to our knowledge of the medieval world. My paternal Masseri family, once prosperous merchants in the Toledo, Spain of the 1400s, fled the Spanish Inquisition to settle in Livorno, Italy, and from there, a branch of the family settled in Cairo in the mid-1700s. My grandfather's branch became respected bankers and financiers. They retained their Italian citizenship and spoke Italian for the 200 years that followed, even after the Khedive of Egypt offered to make my grandfather Joseph his minister of finance, but only if he would abandon his Italian citizenship and take Egyptian nationality. My grandfather politely refused, but my grandmother, Jean Naggar, became lady-in-waiting to the Sultana, representing the Jewish community at the palace. A street close to our home was named Joseph Masseri Street in my grandfather's honor, and in 1956, in the ultimate insult, my father was sent to the government offices on Joseph Masseri Street to collect the exit visas for his family to leave Egypt forever. The maternal side of my father's family The fun-loving, expansive, prolific Aguillon family settled in Amsterdam. Tradition has it that one of my grandmother's ancestors from Holland was a follower of the false messiah, Sabbatai Tzvi. And giggling, we as children searched the Jewish encyclopedia, and despite my gentle granny's staunch protests, claimed that she must be descended from that very ancestor, since in the picture we found of him, he seemed to share Granny's deep-set eyes. The Aguillons, who eventually settled and flourished in Alexandria, like the Moseris, traced their way back to ancestors who fled the Spanish Inquisition to cross the Mediterranean. My ancestor, the first Nassim Moseri, moved his branch of the family to Egypt 3 centuries later. And there, through the years, they became variously influential journalists, jurists, poets, financiers, primarily a family of bankers, responsible for the construction of synagogues and the establishments of hospitals, schools, and orphanages. My grandfather, Joseph Moseri, with his younger brother, Eli Moseri, financed the building of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, and a plaque on the side of the building has their name on it. My maternal grandfather's Smuha family had lived and flourished in Baghdad, probably all the way back to the biblical time of Nebuchadnezzar. Behind my grandfather, I am told, stretches a long line of holy men, their grave sites revered and visited to this day by supplicants with a problem and a prayer. In order to avoid being conscripted into the Iraqi army, the young man Joseph Smuha left Baghdad in 1892 to find work in Manchester, England. His great-grandfather, Ezekiel, had worked as a trusted courier for the British, conveying gold across the desert, and Ezekiel and his family had been awarded British citizenship for their many generations of work as honorary consuls and couriers for the British. And I'd like to read you a very brief story about Ezekiel from the book, Sipping from the Nile. Ezekiel Smuha was an intriguing man of whom many tales are told. He was, it seems, given to prophetic dreams. In one family legend, he was young and restless and had been traveling through the countryside for some time, looking for work or adventure. Night fell, and he stopped at an inn to rest. He was soon fast asleep in his bed, his donkey stabled in the area below the inn. Restless in his sleep, he dreamt that he heard a voice calling him to get up and leave at once. Danger was coming. He woke with a start and sat up in the bed, but the voice still rang in his ears. He ran to the window, but he saw nothing. Still, the voice had been so insistent, the dream so vivid. Reluctantly, he crept downstairs, hoping no one would hear the creaking, unhitched his donkey, led him out of the stable, and rode him into the forest nearby. He hid in the forest, listening to the night creatures rustling around him. But the donkey, incensed at having been disturbed in the middle of the night, began to bray, and fearing for his life, Ezekiel killed him. In the morning, he walked all the way back to the inn, convinced in the clear light of day that he had done a foolish thing and slaughtered his donkey into the bargain. But when he got to the inn, footsore and hungry, he found it silent. All its occupants had been murdered in the night. He alone had escaped. And because he escaped, I am there to tell the tale, as my mother told it to me. Grandpa Smuha tried to join the British Army at the time of the First World War, but was refused because rheumatic fever in his youth had left him with a heart murmur. However, the British government later sent him to Egypt with a mission to evaluate the cotton trade for the government. His mission successfully accomplished, he decided to move his family to the milder clime of Alexandria. His future, although he didn't know it then, lay in Egypt. With a vision far ahead of the times or of his years, he saw possibilities in the swampy, mosquito-infested Hadra lakes on the outskirts of Alexandria. And there, he built a beautiful, ecologically responsible real estate development that included public plazas, wide street-lined boulevards, along with its renowned sports club, golf course, and the finest race course in the Middle East. At the urging of his friend King Fuad, for whom he had tried to name the area, it was named Smuha City, and it drew a stellar cosmopolitan crowd to its villas and many amenities. In Cairo, my parents led an interesting cultural and social life of elegant dinners at their friends' houses or on the roof of the Semiramis Hotel, lights glinting on the dark waters of the Nile below. They heard world-class singers, Caruso, Galli-Curci, at the Cairo Opera House, watched the best ballet troupes from around the world, enjoyed splendid evenings of dîner dansant at the fabled Mina House Hotel or the Auberge des Pyramides. Nonetheless, although miraculously sheltered from the immediate horrors of the Holocaust, the Jews in Egypt were devastated by the rumors and tales flowing out of Europe during the Second World War. The Nazi threat came very, very close. I was only 4, but I do remember hearing the guns of the Battle of El Alamein and finding bits of shrapnel in my Smuha grandparents' garden as my cousins and I played there. My brother Jeff was born to the sounds of battle on the very day of the Allied victory at El Alamein. While the threat must have kept our parents and grandparents awake at night, I learned much later that my Smuha grandfather had in fact been designated by the Germans for the first hanging of a Jew in the public square, an honor I am certain he was happy to avoid. The Jewish experience in Egypt is a complex one. In the post-colonial years, Egypt was a diverse, interactive blend of cultures and religions, languages, and social backgrounds. Historically and culturally, the various Jewish communities circled a common experience through time. They reflected widely divergent origins, which together with the strong colonial influence of the Second World War years, informed a Sephardic Jewish experience somewhat different from that of the other Arab lands. Within their diversity of language, of the social, political, economic, and cultural underpinnings unique to the multi-layered Egyptian Jewish history, it was an Egypt of concentric circles. The various communities shared common experiences, universal passions and tragedies, universal longings and aspirations, filtered through the thread of a common Judaism, but with a widely divergent observance, different familial and ancestral patterns and origins. I always imagine that each of us who remembers Egypt is creating memories made up of variously shaped puzzle pieces. Taken together, they produce an interlocking design, a rich and vivid mosaic that is the pattern of Jewish Egypt through history. Each of us individually tries to hold on to the magic, the contradictions, the crazy politics, and the confusing history of the polyglot multinational thousands who made Egypt their home through the centuries and experienced Egypt's singular hold on the imagination and the heart. The widely dispersed exiled communities, which were 80,000 strong, are still trying to recount their individual tales, each of us reaching a point in our lives where we want to preserve, hoping to find a way to define ourselves as we attempt to regain a foothold in the world outside of the world we once knew, and to define the experience of Egypt itself, so as to pass along to our children and grandchildren the magic and the heritage of a world that no longer exists. The Harit al-Yahud was the ancient Jewish quarter of Cairo, its inhabitants dating back to the time of Maimonides and beyond, indistinguishable in their skull caps and white galabeas from the Muslim communities that surrounded them. An only child until I was 5, my childhood world was one of privilege and comfort, surrounded by loving family in a large, comfortable mansion filled with family and servants. The house stood across from the Nile River in an expansive garden which I explored with interest, later riding the paths on my bicycle under the mango trees with my younger brother and sister, and following my Aunt Helen and Aboudi the gardener, fierce in his turban and swirling white galabia, as they planned and pruned, admired the fragrant blooms, and walked the concentric circles of the rose garden together. There was a little synagogue in one corner of the garden, filled on Saturdays and religious holidays with our family and those neighbors who walked to join us from other large mansions in Giza on the borders of the Nile. Downstairs, where my father and brother prayed, was a minyan of white-garbed men from the Jewish quarter, the Harit al-Yahud, who filed in together at the start of services, hurrying along the vine-covered pathway to the small synagogue. They nodded and bowed, shouted responses, swaying, rising, sitting, voluble and intense. They would be invited to a Sabbath meal on the lawn outside after services, shepherded to their seats by a small, rotund fellow in a European suit named Maurice, who always brought my grandmother the herbs to smell at the close of the Sabbath. I sat upstairs in the tiny women's gallery, flanked by my mother, grandmother, aunt, and other visiting ladies, trying to sit still, listening to the soothing whisper of my grandmother, immersed in her prayers, as she turned the pages of her tiny, well-worn, leather-bound prayer book. The odd thing is that to a small girl, it was all a normal way of life, until I started my school days at the age of 5. And that's when I began to encounter children who had very different lives from mine. I remember riding to school in our chauffeur-driven little black Ford along the Nile to Zamalek every day, accompanied by Vera, my nanny. My mother always came to pick me up after school. Seeing Hussein, our driver, grinning now and then as he listened to our chatter. His father had been chauffeur to my grandfather. I remember the flowers that carpeted the road, blue jacaranda, red poinsettia, dusty eucalyptus trees standing guard at the borders of the road, and profusions of pink and red bougainvillea spilling over walls as we drove past. Every year of our childhood, as the winter holidays from school approached, we drove through the desert to Alexandria, to the home of my Smuha grandparents, where aunts and uncles, cousins, and festivities surrounding my grandfather's January 1st birthday awaited us. It was a big thrill and a bonding experience to share a room with my girl cousins, older and younger, and to whisper gossip and revelations about life deep into the night. I attended elementary school at the Gezira Preparatory School in Zamalek, Cairo, with schoolmates named variously Nadia, Shahira, Nellie, Michelle, Sumaya, Shirley, Mohammed, Colin, Eric, Bobby, children in my grade whose names I still remember. Incidentally, Bobby, whose real name was Jean Naggar, became my brother-in-law 59 years ago when he returned to his parents' home in Paris after fighting in the French-Algerian War. None of us ever asked or wondered what religious or ethnic background a school friend came from. We were who we were, and what we were was a collection of kids of about the same age who were trying for the first time to navigate a world independent of parental control, who formed fast friendships, squabbled among themselves, who played marbles and hopscotch in the small dusty schoolyard, and who never once imagined that any one of us was more or less entitled than any other to grow up in Egypt and live there for the rest of our lives. When I was 12, I left the English school at Heliopolis to attend the Rodin School, a boarding school in England, following the tradition of my mother, her sisters, and my older cousins. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. From my 12th to my 18th year, I only lived in Egypt during the winter holidays. I left Rodin when I was 18 and returned home, thrilled to be in the real world and agog with plans and excitement, planning for a university degree, just in time for the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the end of the life and world I had seen as mine forever. Egypt has lived on in my heart from then on, a magical place of happy celebrations with a large extended family, mighty mansions to remember, magnificent palaces visited, gorgeous gardens and flowering trees, the delights of the Muski with its scents and exuberant stalls spilling color and chaos, and a small girl climbing carefully among the tangled roots of the huge old banyan tree at the end of the big lawn at the Gezira Sporting Club, while my cousin Brian climbed higher and higher, and my parents sat with friends and watched from the shade and comfort of the restaurant by the pool. Egypt was the home I returned to in my heart, time and again, even though I had to come to terms with the fact that Egypt had rejected me, rejected my family and my friends, casting us instantly into a world that would never understand what we left behind, the selves that were annihilated simply because we were Jewish. My family was Italian, not a part of the British, French, or Israeli communities whose brief attack had attempted to secure the Suez Canal in that autumn of 1956. It did not matter. The generations of public service did not matter. We were Jewish. We had to leave. Along with the British colonial influence, the French cultural influence in Egypt dated back to the Napoleonic Wars. Many Jews growing up in Egypt were the beneficiaries of a rich lycée education, and alongside Arabic, French and English were the communication currency among the elite and an educated middle class. My father had been educated in the lycée, so along with Shakespeare and the kings and queens of England, we grew up hearing him recite the wonderful dramatic passages he knew from memory from Racine and Corneille. Both parents were totally bilingual and knew more languages besides. In our household, we grew up from our earliest childhood with a medley of languages sounding around us: French, English, Italian, a smattering of Arabic, Hebrew, Yugoslav. Some other families spoke Ladino or Greek, and it was easy to insert a concept or phrase from another language that better expressed what we wanted to say, and we could be pretty certain that it would be understood. Those of us who left Egypt as a result of the Suez Crisis have never lost touch with the memories that trailed us into exile. Whether the path that awaited us was smooth or rocky, each of us struggled to settle into new lives, to save something of ourselves to share with children and grandchildren. We tried to recreate the rich, wonderful foods we remembered in our small kitchens and to maintain our grasp on a childhood and a world forever lost to us. We did our best to reflect the Jewish diaspora from Egypt by exploring and laying claim to the nature of our Egyptian Sephardic heritage, the foods, the sounds and smells, the nostalgia and mingled languages that helped us to preserve Egypt as we knew and loved it, an Egypt that has irrevocably vanished. I was 19 years old when I left my home in Egypt permanently, blown into a larger life and wider world by those fierce winds of change. I was fortunate in having had a life experience that had given me glimpses of that larger world. For those whose lives had been entirely bounded by the Egyptian experience, the surgical severance from everything they had known was much harder. I tried to reflect that reality in my novel, Footprints on the Heart. Exile is never easy. So much is lost to the bitter necessity of surviving. Some people are able to swim to shore, but others drown in the waves and are never able to find foothold. All of that, I hope, I was able to reflect in my fictional work, in my novel, which is Footprints on the Heart. I forged ahead with my married life in America for many years, not taking a moment to look back. In those years, I became the mother of 3 children and eventually the founder of a literary agency. My husband shared my Egyptian past and my love of reading, and together we set about creating an American future for our family. As a literary agent, I reveled in the privilege of working with the creative work of so many talented others. Little time to think, no time to write. Egypt lay dormant. I was too busy. But when I became a grandmother, I felt a stirring need to document the world of my youth for my grandchildren to discover in time. I began to put together memories and incidents from my youth and wove them into a memoir, Sipping from the Nile, My Exodus from Egypt. I was still working full-time, and it took me several years and much encouragement from friends and relatives before I actually held the finished book in my hand. My childhood dream was to write fiction. I loved reading. Because I read voraciously and was so enamored of fiction, by the time I was 9 years old, I had decided that I would write my own novels one day. With that in mind, I wrote to the British author Enid Blyton, whose many stories fed my imagination and filled my waking hours. I had learned that she published a small magazine, Sunny Stories, so I sent her a story. Enid Blyton responded, to my amazement, with a handwritten postcard, in which she wrote that sadly, Sunny Stories had ceased to exist. However, she added that I should definitely continue to write. My 9-year-old self took this as a message from the gods. The postcard itself, a little battered, has somehow weathered exile, travel, working years, life events, its words resonating throughout my busy life, and I treasure it still. And because a busy, famous author took the trouble to respond to a 9-year-old girl in Cairo, Egypt, I always respond to my mails and emails. As we age, which I can now attest to, most of us find that the gaps that separate us from later generations widen slowly with the passing years. But the chasm that appeared in my own life was not a gradual shifting of the world as it moved through time. In my life, one climactic moment crashed through the secure, seemingly immutable world of my childhood, leaving only ashes of memory and the pain of loss. The forces of politics, economics, and war tore through the delicate protective fabric that had sheltered my world until then. The catalyst for writing Sipping from the Nile came zooming out of left field soon after the birth of my first 2 grandsons. I became anxious to record the entire web of people and circumstance that had led to my becoming a grandmother, this transformative moment in my life. This heightened perspective prodded relentlessly at the past I had buried deep, for so many years. Sadly, so many of the people I had known and loved now lived only in my heart and in my memory. Some of the questions that arose again and again would now never have answers. I began to sense that I myself was a mere fragment in time, the sum of choices made by dimly perceived ancestors in an unknowable distant past. I understood that these young grandchildren, whom I had welcomed with such joy, would be growing up so distant from me in generation, time, and space, that unless I recorded my own past, they would never know about those people I had known and loved, the people whose choices and destinies had woven the fabric that provided the texture of myself, and the people and circumstances whose lives led directly into their lives. I had grown up in that large, extended Sephardic family with deep cultural roots in Italy, the Middle East, and England. It was my world, and it had vanished in 1956 with the shock waves of the Suez Crisis. And I wrote early in my memoir, in Sipping from the Nile, all our history changed irrevocably that dazzling sunny day as I stood on the stone terrace outside my bedroom and watched the world of my childhood ripple away, drowning in the heavy gray waters of the Nile. Like a submerged Atlantis, it would shimmer faintly under the swell of life, invisible, untouchable, lost. But at the end of Sipping from the Nile, I wrote, "The past is never gone. It is the foundation on which we build the present every day of our lives." And that is the sum of what I really want to say. So thank you all for listening. And I know we have some other pictures that we can show you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jean. You read my mind. I'm going to invite the audience now to submit their questions for you using the Q&A button if you're joining us on Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook, to use the comments. And while people are submitting their questions, I wonder if we can look at some of the images that you shared so we can see some of your family members. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. We can look at some of the photos.
These are my parents, Joyce Mosseri and Joyce Smuha and Guido Mosseri, on their honeymoon in Aswan, Egypt, in Upper Egypt. And very soon after they returned home, I began. So I love to see them so young and so happy. This was their wedding cake. And here is an image of the wedding of my Smuha grandparents. My grandmother was very young when she got married, and the handsome fellow with the mustache is my grandfather, Joseph Smuha. And here they were in Manchester, England, on the roof of I forget the Midland Hotel, I can't remember the name of it, but the hotel in 1908. And these are my Mosseri family. On the left, as I watch, is Auntie Helen. And as you can see, a very strong person. And on the right is my Granny Mosseri, both of whom I grew up with in the household where I grew up. This is my grandfather, who I never knew, Joseph Mosseri, I'm sorry, who died several years before my father married. And here is the Smuha family in its youth. There are my grandparents in the middle, Rosa and Joseph Smuha, and my mother is the shy-looking person in the back row, the first on the left, with her brothers and sisters. And here she's the first on the right, again with her whole family. this is Joseph Smuha, my grandfather, in his later years. This is how I remember him. And I always remember that he always smelled of wonderful eau de cologne when he kissed me, and his moustache always scraped my cheek. This is the house where I grew up. And actually, there's a balcony on the right, and the far right window is where we had our nurseries, my brother, sister, and I, with our nanny Vera. And my parents had their rooms facing the Nile. This is an older photo before it got built up, and you can see all the wonderful trees around and the houseboats on the Nile. This was a little sitting room on one side of the entrance to the house, and it was always called the Arab sitting room because it was decorated in the Arab style. This was the stairway up to the from the downstairs hallway, which was vast, to the upstairs hallway, which was also pretty vast to a little girl anyway. And I do remember when I was very small, and I used to be told to go downstairs and shake hands with the ladies who had come to play bridge and have tea with my grandmother. I do remember imagining what it would be like to just drift down those stairs instead of having to walk down them. And I imagined drifting down there and meeting all those ladies who used to pinch my cheeks and say what a shame it was that I didn't have beautiful red hair like my mother. This is really not because it's me, but that's me playing the violin on the terrace outside our room. And I wanted to show the vista, which I think was really magnificent, but which I never appreciated at the time. It was just what it was.
Thank you. It was great to see those images and really get a sense of the world in which you grew up in. So now I'm going to turn over to audience Q&A and see what questions they have for you. Let's see. Oh, this first one, does the house still exist? Is it still standing?
That's a good question. Yes, it is. It's now the Russian embassy.
Oh, wow.
And it has, instead of a lacy iron grill on the outside of the garden, it's covered in a strong material, so you can't see in. It's the Russian embassy.
And
But
you
it's
mentioned
still
that
there.
there was, oh, sorry. You mentioned that there was a synagogue right near the house. What was the name of the synagogue?
Well, it was the Maseri synagogue. I mean, it was just it was the way, you would have had a parochial church in a big mansion. This was a little synagogue in the garden. It didn't actually have a name that I know of, but it was, my father had it demolished before the Russians moved in, so it doesn't exist anymore.
Okay. There's some questions about whether you've been back to Egypt and about, is there any Jewish presence in Egypt currently?
Well, I'd like to start with the second half of that first, which is that there may be something like 5 or 6 descendants of Egyptian Jews, and there may be some Egyptian Jews who do not call themselves Jews who are still there. But otherwise, of the 80,000 Jews, no one is left. People kind of left within, I think, mostly the 10 years following the Suez Crisis. And they were no longer welcome, and they were encouraged to leave. There were some very difficult incarcerations, and people left with big bad memories on their shoulders. But so I'm sorry, what was the first half again?
If you've been back to Egypt since you left.
Yes, we went back in what was it, 1990, I think, just before when our children were all grown up and our daughter was spending time in a kibbutz in Israel. She was the youngest. And so our two sons came from work in Egypt, in America, New York, and they joined us in Egypt. And it took me 6 months to be able to get the visa, the permission to visit our house. And I kept running into a brick wall. And then suddenly somebody in publishing, a friend of mine in publishing, said, "Oh, but didn't you know that the head of the publishing association used to be an ambassador in Egypt?" I said, "No, I didn't know." I called him immediately, and he gave me the personal phone number of the ambassador, the American ambassador in Egypt, and said, American citizens who had been born there wanted to visit their childhood home. And we did. And it was actually a wonderful visit because it happened to be glasnost, which was, sort of a peaceful moment between Russia and the rest of the world. And the young people the young secretary and were the same ages as our children. And so they welcomed us with such excitement because we had built the house, or our family had, and they had prepared a special tea in what used to be my mother's piano room. And they had, there was champagne, there was vodka, there was all sorts of goodies. And my children and they had a wonderful time talking about their two very different worlds. So it was really interesting, and it was a wonderful visit. And we ended up going up the river to Aswan and visiting there as well.
Wonderful. There's a question here about the title of your book, Sipping from the Nile. How did you come up with that title? And does it refer to an actual experience?
Yes and no. I didn't come up with the title. My son-in-law, Michael, did. And it was because he read in the book about a custom, which was that my grandmother would appear just as we were about to go on a journey anywhere and have the servant bring a tray of glasses of water, because the belief was if you drank from the Nile, you would always return. So sipping from the Nile was what we did. It wasn't really Nile water. You wouldn't have drunk that, but it must have originated around there. And we did return.
Prophetic.
Yes.
There's a comment here from someone in the audience that says, "My family was forced out of Egypt at around the same time as yours when they were a small child. And they understood it that it was because their mother had British citizenship and not because they were Jewish." Have you ever heard something similar, or
You mean about our mother?
No, about this audience members, they were who had heard that she was forced out of Egypt because her mother had British citizenship, but not because they were Jewish. Have you heard any similar stories around different reasonings for people being forced to leave Egypt at around that time?
Yes, I'm sure all the British, anyone with any British and French connections in that way were immediately expelled. And people were expelled with, the clothes on their backs. They left everything behind. And my family was Italian. My mother had been British before she married my father, but then she became Italian. So basically, they both had Italian passports and should not have been expelled because they were not part of the force that was trying to attack. And it didn't make any difference.
I think
Well, it did. I'm sorry. Let me just shadow that, because it made a difference in that we did not get expelled instantly. We then were enabled to leave the country within a period of time.
I think I'll ask this one last question about the photos that you shared. Was someone able to take those photos with them out of Egypt? How were you able to have those photos to share with us today?
Well, when we realized what was happening around us and that we were going to have to leave, my mother organized suitcases. They were these big brown leather suitcases from the Muski, and they were filled with things, and we had what we would take if it was one suitcase we could take, what we would take if it were two suitcases, and always in the first suitcase were photos.
Like planning for a disaster today. You always you
She
have to think
wanted
about what you
something.
prioritize, and the photos are such an important piece of that.
Yes, absolutely.
So with that, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Jean, for sharing your knowledge and sharing your personal family story with us this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Tracy Dorfman for introducing today's program, and Trillian for providing tech support, and thank all of you in the audience for joining us today, for asking your questions and for sharing your stories as well. So before we go, we're going to be dropping a couple links into the chat. First, we'll have a link where you can register for the upcoming program that was mentioned in the introduction. Join us on Sunday, September 12th at 1 p.m. for a presentation on the Ashkenazi Jewish community in Mexico with Adina Samet. So there'll be a link to register for that. Next, there'll be a link for you to for you to watch any of our past programs within this series, Exploring Global Jewish Life. So you can view the recordings of those events using the next link in chat. Next, there'll be links where you can explore more of Jean's work. There's a link to her personal website, as well as links for you to check out her books, her memoir, Sipping from the Nile, and her novel, Footprints on the Heart. And finally, as a reminder, as you leave the webinar this afternoon, you'll be directed to a survey about your experience. If you could take just a few moments to fill out this anonymous survey, it really does help us as we plan for future programs. And so with that, I would like to say thank you again to Jean, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.